There are people who live inside a world the eye cannot see, a world made of possibilities, imagined futures, alternate versions of themselves, none of which ever fully exist, yet all of which feel painfully real. Their minds travel ahead before their bodies take a single step. Every decision becomes a forked path. Every moment becomes a quiet calculation. And every version of themselves becomes a question they can't quite answer. To others, they seem thoughtful, careful, maybe even wise. But inside, it is not wisdom they feel. It is the weight of constant imagining, the fear of choosing wrong, the ache of becoming the wrong self, the pressure to exist perfectly in a world that asks for too much. Overthinking is not noise. It is a language of survival, learned long before they knew what it meant. There are people who live quietly, even when nothing about their inner world is quiet. They move through life with steady steps, soft expressions, and a calmness that appears effortless. But beneath that soft exterior, their minds stretch far beyond the present moment. They're not just thinking, they are imagining, simulating, predicting, questioning. They are testing every version of themselves before the world ever sees one. For them, life happens twice, first in their minds, then in reality. Sometimes even more than twice. They rehearse conversations that might never happen. They prepare for outcomes that may never occur. They explore identities they will never choose. And even though nobody else sees this mental world, it becomes the place they spend most of their time. It starts subtly. A simple choice becomes a branching tree of possibilities. A moment of silence becomes a space where old memories echo. A question becomes a doorway to 10 more questions. This is not chaos. It is not panic. It is something more delicate, a constant attempt to understand themselves before anyone else can misunderstand them. Overthinkers carry a quiet desire to make the right choice, to be the right person, to avoid hurting others or disappointing themselves. Their thoughts are not loud. They are layered. They are soft, steady waves that build until they fill the entire horizon. In their minds, they become the observer of their own life, watching, processing, anticipating, trying to fold every possibility into something safe, something predictable. They imagine the version of themselves who speaks confidently, the version who stays silent, the version who leaves, the version who stays, the version who chooses differently and becomes someone they're not sure they're ready to be. And because the mind never stops offering alternatives, they never fully settle into the present one. From the outside, it can look like hesitation, but on the inside, it feels like responsibility. A responsibility to get it right, to not waste time, to not make the wrong move, to not become the wrong self. This inner world is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost sacred. It is a place where they retreat to think and sometimes to hide, not from others, but from the pressure of being seen without preparation, from the fear of stepping into the world unready. They often understand people more than people understand them. They notice details others talk over. They sense shifts others dismiss. They read tone, silence, and hesitation like a language. But when it comes to themselves, everything feels less clear. They can imagine 10 possible interpretations for their own actions, yet none of them feel certain. They can picture 10 futures, yet each carries a different version of who they must become. This constant imagining creates a soft distance between them and the world, not because they don't care, but because they care too deeply about what each moment means, who it will turn them into, and what part of themselves they may lose or gain. Overthinkers live in the in-between, between memory and possibility, between who they are and who they could be, between action and hesitation, between choosing and wondering what might unfold if they don't. They're not lost. They're simply navigating a map that expands every time they look at it. And although the world may see indecision, what actually lives inside them is sensitivity, a deep awareness of how every choice shapes identity. They're not afraid of life. They are afraid of becoming someone they never intended to be. This silent world within is not a flaw. It is a reflection of a mind that feels everything before it happens, and a heart that wants to understand its place in every possibility. Overthinking does not begin in adulthood. It begins quietly, in rooms where a child once learned how small moments could change everything. It begins in the pauses between someone else's mood and the child's breath. It begins where safety depended not on freedom, but on anticipation. Some children grow up in worlds where uncertainty felt larger than they were. A raised voice, a shifting expression, a sudden change in tone. None of it needed to be dramatic. Even gentle homes can teach a child to scan for emotional signals if love felt unpredictable, or if approval was tied to performance, or if mistakes were treated as something more than learning moments. For a child, the world is not logical. It is emotional. They do not think, I need to be careful. They simply learn to be careful because it keeps them connected to the people they depend on. Overthinking, in its earliest form, is a child studying the room, studying faces, studying moments, trying to sense what is expected before anyone says it. They learn to imagine multiple outcomes because one outcome could lead to affection, and another could lead to silence, disappointment, or conflict. This is how a mind becomes a weather forecaster, always scanning for storms. Not because storms were constant, but because even one unpredictable storm can shape the way a child learns to move through life. Some grew up with caregivers who were loving but inconsistent, present then distant, warm then distracted, engaged then overwhelmed. Others lived in environments where perfection was praised, while mistakes carried consequences that felt heavier than they should have. A child who feels they must get it right learns to imagine every wrong that could happen, not to avoid trouble, but to avoid the feeling of being the reason someone else is upset, disappointed, or withdrawn. And some children simply grew up too fast. They became the emotional interpreters of their homes, the quiet peacekeepers, the ones who noticed everything so others didn't have to. When a child learns to think ahead in order to feel safe, the mind adapts beautifully. It becomes sharp, observant, attuned. But the same skill that once protected them becomes exhausting in adulthood. The grown overthinker still watches for emotional storms that will never come. They still rehearse words so nobody gets hurt. They still choose the version of themselves that feels least likely to disrupt the balance around them. Not because danger exists, but because their body remembers a time when it did. The origins of overthinking are often hidden in moments that seemed small at the time. A parent saying, "Why would you do that?" with disappointment. A teacher praising achievement more than effort. A sibling's unpredictable reactions. A silent dinner table where feelings were noticed but never named. A home where love existed, but communication was fragile. Children do not know they are overthinking. They simply believe they are being good, being prepared, being considerate, being whatever version of themselves keeps the peace. By the time they grow up, the habit is no longer conscious. It becomes the lens through which they see themselves. The adult overthinker does not trace their patterns back to childhood. They simply feel a familiar tension, a familiar pressure, a familiar need to pre-live every moment so they aren't caught off guard. The origins are not about blame. They are about understanding. Because when overthinkers look backwards, they often discover something surprising. Their habit was never rooted in weakness. It came from a desire to stay connected, to stay safe, to stay loved. It came from a time when imagining every possible version of themselves felt like the only way to protect the version that mattered most, the child they once were, who simply wanted to belong. And even now, that longing still lives quietly underneath every thought. The mind of an overthinker is not chaotic. It is organized in a way that only makes sense when you understand what the brain is trying to do. Its goal is simple: prevent pain before it arrives. Its methods, however, are anything but simple. Deep inside the brain, there's a network called the default mode network, the system that activates when the mind drifts inward. For most people, this network wanders through light reflections and stray memories. But for the overthinker, it becomes a theater of possibilities, alternate futures, imagined reactions, and versions of themselves shaped by fear, hope, doubt, and desire. This network is not broken. It is simply overactive, trained by years of anticipating what could happen next. The mind begins with a single thought, then another, then another. One possibility opens the door to five more. And before they realize it, the present moment dissolves beneath layers of imagined futures. Psychology calls this cognitive looping, thought patterns that circle back on themselves, looking for certainty where certainty doesn't exist. The loop begins with a question that feels harmless. What if I choose wrong? What if they misunderstand me? What if I disappoint someone? What if I become someone I don't want to be? Each question is a quiet attempt to predict an outcome, to reduce risk, to remove the unknown. But the unknown cannot be removed. And so the mind keeps looping, searching for a level of clarity the world cannot give. There is also uncertainty intolerance, a psychological trait where even small unknowns feel emotionally heavy. For the overthinker, uncertainty is not just uncomfortable, it feels unsafe. They imagine every outcome not because they want control, but because unpredictability awakens old emotional echoes from a time when they needed to foresee everything just to feel secure. Another element is hypervigilance, a heightened awareness of emotional details, tones, expressions, pauses, silences. The brain stays alert, scanning for signs of rejection, conflict, or disappointment, even in safe environments. It's not paranoia, it's sensitivity, a sensitivity that was once adaptive, even protective. Then there is perfectionism, though not in the traditional sense of wanting everything flawless. For the overthinker, perfectionism is often emotional, a desire to avoid mistakes that could lead to regret, embarrassment, or hurting others. They don't fear failure as much as they fear the emotional consequences of failure. So the mind tries to imagine every version of themselves who could prevent it. Scientifically, overthinking is also tied to the brain's threat detection system, the amygdala. It doesn't only activate when danger is present. It activates when danger is possible, or imagined, or remembered. A neutral situation can begin to feel emotionally loaded. A simple choice can feel tied to identity. A single decision can feel like a map of who they might become. And then there's the most tender layer of all, self-concept uncertainty. Overthinkers often struggle not because they don't know who they are, but because they can imagine so many possible versions of themselves that choosing one feels like abandoning the rest. They think, what if I'm supposed to be someone different? What if the version I choose is the wrong one? What if the path I take closes the door to who I might have been? This psychological pressure creates an internal split between the self they are, the selves they imagine, and the self they fear becoming. It is not indecision. It is identity exploration happening too fast, too intensely, too often. The brain does not overthink because it is malfunctioning. It overthinks because it is trying to protect a person who once needed protection. It is trying to predict pain before it arrives. It is trying to understand the future before the future becomes real. Overthinking is not a sign of weakness. It is the mind's attempt to create safety in a world where outcomes can't be controlled, and where the self is still trying to understand who it is allowed to be.